Lysander Spooner, The Science of Justice, Natural Law, published 1882. Chapter 3, Natural Law Contrasted with Legislation. Section 1. Natural law, natural justice, being a principle that is naturally applicable and adequate to the rightful settlement of every possible controversy that can arise among men, being, too, the only standard by which any controversy whatever between man and man can be rightfully settled, being a principle whose protection every man demands for himself, whether he is willing to accord it to others or not, being also an immutable principle, one that is always and everywhere the same, in all ages and nations, being self-evidently necessary in all times and places, being so entirely impartial and equitable towards all, so indispensable to the peace of mankind everywhere, so vital to the safety and welfare of every human being, being, too, so easily learned, so generally known, and so easily maintained by such voluntary associations as all honest men can readily and rightfully form for that purpose. Being such a principle as this, these questions arise, viz., why is it that it does not universally, or well-nigh universally, prevail? Why is it that it has not, ages ago, been established throughout the world as the one only law that any man or all men could rightfully be compelled to obey? Why is it that any human being ever conceived that anything so self-evidently superfluous, false, absurd, and atrocious as all legislation necessarily must be, could be of any use to mankind, or have any place in human affairs? The answer is that through all historic times, wherever any people have advanced beyond the savage state and have learned to increase their means of subsistence by the cultivation of soil, a greater or less number of them have associated and organized themselves as robbers, to plunder and enslave all others, who had either accumulated any property that could be seized, or who had shown by their labor that they could be made to contribute to the support or pleasure of those who should enslave them. These bands of robbers, small in number at first, have increased their power by uniting with each other, inventing warlike weapons, disciplining themselves and perfecting their organizations as military forces, and dividing their plunder, including their captives, among themselves, either in such proportions as have been previously agreed on, or in such as their leaders, always desirous to increase the number of their followers, should prescribe. The success of these bands of robbers was an easy thing, for the reason that those whom they plundered and enslaved were comparatively defenseless, being scattered thinly over the country, engaged wholly in trying, by rude implements and heavy labor, to extort subsistence from the soil, having no weapons of war other than sticks and stones, having no military discipline or organization, and no means of concentrating their forces or acting in concert when suddenly attacked. Under these circumstances, the only alternative left them for saving even their lives, or the lives of their families, was to yield up not only the crops they had gathered and the lands they had cultivated, but themselves and their families also as slaves. Thenceforth their fate was, as slaves, to cultivate for others the lands they had before cultivated for themselves. Being driven constantly to their labor, wealth slowly increased, but all went into the hands of their tyrants. These tyrants, living solely on plunder and on the labor of their slaves, and applying all their energies to the seizure of still more plunder and the enslavement of still other defenseless persons, increasing too their numbers, perfecting their organizations, and multiplying their weapons of war, they extend their conquests until, in order to hold what they have already got, it becomes necessary for them to act systematically and cooperate with each other in holding their slaves in subjection. But all this they can only do by establishing what they call a government and making what they call laws. All the great governments of the world, those now existing as well as those that have passed away, have been of this character. They have been mere bands of robbers who have associated for purposes of plunder, conquest, and the enslavement of their fellow men. And their laws, as they have called them, have been only such agreements as they have found it necessary to enter into in order to maintain their organizations, and act together in plundering and enslaving others and in securing to each his agreed share of the spoils. All these laws have had no more real obligation than have the agreements which brigands, bandits, and pirates find it necessary to enter into with each other for the more successful accomplishment of their crimes and the more peaceable division of their spoils. Thus, substantially all the legislation of the world has had its origin in the desires of one class of persons to plunder and enslave others and hold them as property.